Bill.
Hey, Alan, how are you?
I'm doing very well. How about yourself?
Doing great. My video went off here, but I'm assuming you all can see me. So let me just start by welcoming and thanking everybody for joining us. Today, we want to explore what leadership looks like in a crisis, particularly since we're in the middle of a dynamic and unfolding global crisis. And we're all seeing a series of leaders in the current moment, not just the president and the presidency, which we study here at the Miller Center, but also governors, mayors, business leaders, university leaders, healthcare professionals. Speaking personally, some of the hardest conversations I've had in the last month or so have been as a parent, although I should say that one of the lessons I've learned is never to underestimate your so-called subordinates. In any crisis, there's rarely a playbook. A lot of improvisation goes on. And while there may be plans or preceding crises to look at, the old saying goes that no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. In fact, maybe the definition of a crisis, or at least part of a definition, is a sudden shock with unavoidable and often vast differences from previous shocks. And seeing the differences in a particular crisis from its predecessors may be one dimension of an effective response and of an effective leader. That's not to say that nothing can't be learned from past crises. In fact, a devastating crisis like the one that we're looking at right now can help sharpen our understanding of leadership and bring forward some of our greatest leaders. And so to discuss that and so many other topics around leadership in crisis, we have one of the leading experts in the country and in the world, and certainly at the University of Virginia, Professor Allan Stam. Allan is a faculty senior fellow with us at the Miller Center. He's also a university professor at UVA and teaches at the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. Allan holds a PhD from the University of Michigan, where he also taught the International Policy Center for Michigan School of Public Policy. He's taught at Dartmouth and Yale, authored numerous books, and served our country in the US Army. Allan specializes in war and duration, outcomes, mediations, and political alliances. So in addition to being a teacher and a leader himself, he's also researched the topic. So Allan, we're really thrilled to have you with us today. So without further ado, let's get started. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of leadership in a crisis?
That's a really good question. I think that almost anyone in a leadership role, when facing a problem, will try to look back either through their own mental Rolodex or talk to the people in their leadership community to see if there's a precedent. Is there another situation that the organization, the country, the state has been in that's similar to the situation that they find themselves in the moment? And I think that in the current problem or crisis or challenge that we're facing as a country and as a state and communities right now, the great challenge we face is that this is a really unique crisis. What makes it so unusual is both not just the scale of the problem or problems that we're confronting, but the number of relatively unique crises that are occurring simultaneously. So the issue that is on the forefront of almost everyone's mind, literally around the world, is this global pandemic, which, if it pans out the way many epidemiologists fear, could turn out to be one of the 2 or 3 worst of literally the past 200 years. Perhaps the best precedent for that would be the 1918 influenza pandemic, or maybe the 1956-57 pandemic. We're also experiencing a severe global economic contraction, the likes of which we probably haven't seen since 1927. That's close to 100 years. The United States is engaged in a power transition with China, meaning the United States either we're in the midst of or will very soon have to recognize that China has surpassed the United States, at least in terms of economic capacity. If we look at our own political system today in the United States, we see a degree of political polarization between the two leading parties, Democrats and Republicans, that we haven't seen since at least the 1870s. Again, over 100 years. The levels of economic interdependence and vulnerability that the United States and other countries, Europeans, the Chinese are facing is literally without precedent in modern industrial, economic, political history. Today, we're seeing the rise, again, globally, of a generation of populist national leaders. We haven't seen this at the international level since the 1930s. And last but not least, we have a president in the United States who was unsuccessfully impeached, who is in the midst of running for re-election. And that is literally without precedent. All of these things individually would be a great, enormous challenge for both leaders at the national level and as well as at the state and local. But the combination of all of these things occurring simultaneously means we really don't have a playbook for how to understand them collectively. Each of them individually has a precedent, but together we're sort of in uncharted waters. Unfortunately, the American system is poorly designed, and in most cases deliberately, to deal with novel crises that occur of large scale. The financial bailout notwithstanding, the United States doesn't have a command economy. I think for most of the time, for the better, but at times of crisis, we have a national culture of fierce independence, autonomy, self-sufficiency, and critically skepticism about central authority that requires leaders to be able to persuade, not order or dictate to American citizens. In the context of the pandemic, we have a drug and disease bureaucracy that's designed to require both safety and efficacy, that these two factors be proven before the adoption of novel treatments or vaccines. We have a system of political checks and balances that go from top to bottom, that are designed to slow government action at the national as well as state level. We live in an information environment that no longer has a news cycle of new information followed by a quiet period, perhaps even just 20 hours for gestation and deliberate thought. Our Constitution limits how invasive government surveillance can be. And again, in the context of a crisis, somewhat unfortunately, we have a large national economy based on maximizing efficiency, not security. We have global supply chains, no longer simply a national supply chain. We have just-in-time delivery systems that were designed to eliminate storage and warehousing of large backlogs of inventories. The challenges that our leaders at national, state, and local levels facing today are simply extraordinary. We should probably cut them a little bit of slack. We should probably be generous in spirit as they do their best to struggle through these difficult times. I think that if we think back over the last 6 to 8 weeks, leaders of both parties at all levels surely would like to walk back some of their comments or remarks. They would probably do the same with some of the choices if they knew then what they know today. For all of our differences, though, for example, we can see that we're roughly in the same boat as the Western Europeans. So again, as it settles in that the challenges we face are both local, national, but global as well, I think we need to sort of check our hubris at the door. And so I'll stop there on that somewhat downbeat assessment of where we are and hope that answered in a long-winded way your very short opening question.
It's a great way to get into the topic, and we're all appreciative of how much thought you've put into that, because there are so many different challenges here in the complexity. Let me jump to one thing that you talked about, and you had a couple different dimensions of it. You started in talking about balancing safety and efficacy in testing drugs. In some sense, that's in the political context, that's what Congress and a two-branch Congress does in the United States, as opposed to in a parliamentary system where the government and parliament are one. So we tend to put in a lot of speed breaks. How does our system then deal with crises? We are quite used to a deliberative process. The Senate is called the cooling saucer in the American political system. But when something's hot and it needs to be dealt with in a hot way, how does a leader deal with that? How do you get both safety and efficacy in a condensed time period?
Again, a great question. If we look back on history, the sort of somewhat unfortunate answer is historically, in the United States, we've muddled through. If we think back to World War II, for example, there had been signs on the horizon for several years that the United States was waiting, lurching, evolving into both a European and East Asian military crisis. And regardless of the incoming information, the Roosevelt administration preparations were modest at best. It took a period of several months, close to a year, for the United States to be able to ramp up its response. Once it did so, however, it had a capacity that literally no other combination of countries, not even a single country, but combination of countries in the world could match. I think another sort of military security example that was a crisis of very short duration might be the Cuban Missile Crisis, where President Kennedy assembled what became referred to as ExComm, or an executive committee of diplomatic and military experts. And they weighed as much information as they possibly could in a very short period of time, a handful of weeks, and came to a quite dramatic series of decisions over the space of a small number of days. Fortunately, that crisis turned out well for both the United States and the world. Other crises, if we think back to 1976, the swine flu vaccine crisis, there was information about a pending influenza possible pandemic. And the Ford administration brought together a group of epidemiological experts who suggested and advised great caution. In the end, that great caution turned out to have been perhaps not as necessary as thought. And the overabundance of caution in that case ended up harming President Ford's reelection chances in the subsequent election.
I think that those previous examples are really quite telling. Give me this sense, Allan, both from your studies of leaders in crisis and your own experiences. I touched on this a bit in my introduction. How helpful is it to try to use previous moments as a guide? Is it useful for a leader to take a pause in the middle of a crisis, going for a walk, reading a book at night, chatting with his advisors, his or her advisors, to get a sense of previous crises, both what's similar and what's different? Or should you just stay in the moment and play the game you're playing?
I think that's again a question that gets right to the heart of the matter. So one of the very small number of defining characteristics of crises is the time constraint, that people in leadership roles simply do not have sufficient time to gather or develop all the information they would prefer to have. They're forced to make decisions in the matter of between hours and days that under other circumstances, the decisions might be made over the space of literally years. The decisions that, for example, President Trump has had to make about suggesting that states limit outdoor activities and gatherings of people, those decisions needed to be made in the space of days. One of the things that we know about looking back at historical crises of these short, intense periods, leaders frequently do not give themselves needed rest. They end up making decisions exhausted. Their advisors are exhausted, and this is one of the problems that we see in crises. Social psychologists talk a lot about how humans or people, leaders, make decisions under great stress. And whether we like it or not, we as people, we look back at the historical examples we're familiar with. And so this is one of the reasons why it is almost always helpful for leaders to surround themselves with advisors that come from a wide variety of experiences and knowledge, so that there can be a variety of different historical examples and memories and experiences to shape or influence the leaders and the group's judgment and decision-making.
Yeah, you touch on a great point, and I'll ask one more question, but encourage the audience to send in questions and answers through your browser. We've already received a couple, and I'll start pulling from them. And if we get too many, I'll try to combine a few questions together. You talked about getting information, particularly in a short period, and also uncertainty. So there are, Don Rumsfeld's famous saying, there are knowns, unknowns, and unknown unknowns, or knowns, unknowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And then you're getting information from a series of different sources. Typically in a normal planning process, we always, the Miller Center, talk about personnel, process, and priorities before you get into the politics of a particular issue. But when time is compressed and there are all these uncertainties, knowns and unknowns, and you're getting information from a variety of sources, how does a leader, should a leader think about triage? What's the way of identifying the right questions and the right sources of information? Are there guides?
Sure. Even in a short time period crisis, there will be a series of decisions that have to be made, and they can be ranked in a number of different ways. Frequently, probably the most common way is initially is to rank them in order of the time that the decisions have to be made, weighted by the consequence of the decisions. So there might be a relatively low impact, the decision that could or should be made immediately, but because it's low impact, it may be put on a back burner. But there will be some decisions that have to be made right now. President Trump made a decision about doing a partial closure of the United States air borders with China very early on because he was given advice that this might have some impact. He made a decisive choice that was done quickly with probably relatively limited consultation, given the broad numbers of people that could perceive themselves as being able to weigh in on that. At the other end of the spectrum, given the context of the current pandemic crisis, is the development of a vaccine. As Dr. Fauci has said numerous times in interviews, this is something that's going to take 18 months, plus or minus. And so decisions that will take place about that can be handled in a manner that can be taken quite deliberately. Questions having to do with testing, one of the challenges, or again, as many people have acknowledged, both in the administration and elsewhere, questions about testing were pushed back a little bit at the very outset of this crisis. And retrospectively, that turns out to have been not perhaps the best decision. So again, there's a constant tension between the scale of the problem, the resources available, and time pressure. In the military, one of the things that leaders are always trained to think about is, what is the greatest proximate threat, the threat that is right at your doorstep? And there are some things that simply can't be ignored, and those should be dealt with first.
Mm-hmm. Even your answer has so many different pathways that I could jump into there, and it really is quite a fascinating moment. I'll start to draw some questions from our viewers, which has been one of the great gratifying pieces of these webinars. Peter Archie asks, in previous times of economic peril, I've often thought it would be better if CNBC were shut down, the constant stream of bad news only to drive markets down further. In this crisis, most of the negative feedback seems political, either from our president or about him. Would we be better off if the political media, the news, the punditry, and on both sides were required to take the 2 months off?
That's a great observation and question. Historically, in intense national crises of extended duration, both in the United States and in Western Europe, in democratic states, national governments have decided that Mr. Archer's concern is very valid, and they've worked very hard to censor and limit the information and the discussion about decisions that were being made at the national level. If we think back about World War II, what the American public knew about what was going on in the combat theaters, both in Europe and in Asia, in the Pacific, was highly, highly controlled by the War Department, what subsequently became the Defense Department, and the president's communicators. Subsequently, both in national security crises and other types of crises, the United States has flipped in the other direction. If anything, today we err on the side of absolute, utter transparency. That comes with it a lot of really good things. The American public are probably better informed about the actual messiness of policy making than they ever have been. The downside is that, and particularly in a polarized political environment, the news media have become both politically polarized, but they're also driven by great economic concerns. And so that there is a problem of constant agitation of the American people. Essentially, we have a raw nerve that's constantly being irritated by the information industry, which has become an industry in itself. It's unfortunate. I think that, again, sometimes doing the thing that might be preferable for dealing with a crisis, the political consequences of that might be so deleterious that no political leader would have the temerity to make that type of choice today.
Yeah, I mean, I think in watching not just the crisis here in the United States, but as you scan around the world to different countries that have a range of different perspectives on the media, from China to Russia to India, and you then, one can imagine the political scientist 2x2 chart where you can see forms of political freedom and then also forms of decision making. Here in the United States, the states have played a very large role in managing the crisis. In India, we've had, which is a very pluralistic, very strong state democracy, but in that case, the central government made a simple, fast decision that it imposed downward in a free, open press. And so you're seeing there the play out of transparency with centralized decision making, whereas here, I think we're seeing diverse planning and response with a very open and transparent media. And you could compare the two of those to Russia and China, which each have their own. As you watch other leaders around the world, what's jumping out at you? What leaders are responding well? What leaders do you think are not responding well? Or what or if not general statements about the leaders, decisions that you're seeing people making that strike you as not just well informed, but well done with limited information in a crisis?
I think that, we can divide the world, we divide the world along two dimensions. First, the democracies and authoritarian states. The authoritarian states, or those democracies that, not in the not too distant past were fairly authoritarian, have managed through both domestic surveillance systems led by social media and, frankly, cell phones, to have managed to contain both information and the spread of the disease somewhat more effectively than the liberal democracies have. Within the Western or liberal democratic community, I think we can split that into two groups. There are the groups that have had, whose governments are now run by what critics would refer to as populist leadership, what the leaders and their supporters would probably refer to as more politically responsive leaders in leadership. There's been a split there. The populist leaders, Boris Johnson in Great Britain, President Trump in the United States, they were initially a bit more skeptical about some of the economic and health costs associated with the spread of the disease. The non-populist, sort of popularly driven democracies, I think they took some decisions perhaps that were a bit more draconian more quickly. I think we see this in, for example, Germany was a little quicker off the draw, for instance, than Italy and Spain were. In the end, I don't think these distinctions actually have had much difference. And the reason is that this has truly evolved into a global pandemic. Once the disease escaped East Asia and spread throughout Europe and Iran, the notion of elimination of the disease was probably not on the table. This will be something that's argued about for literally decades. But my own judgment is that once we got past the first 6 weeks or so, and we got past the period of the Chinese obfuscating information about this, the hopes for truly containing versus managing the spread of the disease has changed. In relatively short order, again, by democratic policymaking standards, having the community of democratic nations reach consensus in the space of a month to 6 weeks is astonishing. So the critics' voices are welcome, but at the same time, we have to remember that literally dozens of democratic countries have essentially consolidated on a preferred set of policies in, by all other comparisons, quite short order.
Let me pick up on a few things that you said and answer a question from an anonymous attendee, which is, given the deliberative, in thinking about the circle of democracies, given the deliberative nature of democratic governments where one has to consult with the public or publics, as we've seen in our own country, regional and political differences mean that different parts of our public respond differently. How does a leader use expertise to convince a public, right? You have the experts whispering in your ear, and a certain sort of establishment politician might be more attuned to the experts. But establishment politicians have, I think, proven that they have a harder time connecting with the people than populists have. Is there a happy medium in there, or is that do we have to choose?
Sure, and great observation and question again. I feel like I'm being interrogated by somebody that's a professional at this. So there's both private internal use of experts that is essential, and actually and public external use of experts. So for Trump administration, for example, they've made use of both public and private experts. So I think somewhat unprecedented press conferences that the president is holding most afternoons, the people that attend to that, and they've turned into quite well attended public television. The access to the president by the press in these is quite extraordinary. And what he's done, though, he's enabled some public health experts, Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx notably, to develop almost personal relationships with the American people. And if we look at both polling and anecdotal information in the news media, in both the more conservative press as well as the more liberal press, individuals of almost all persuasions have, with obvious exceptions, but almost across the board, people have come to trust these experts, including, frankly, the president, it appears. And so that would be an example of the external use of experts. Privately, we hope, and we don't know because it's private, leaders ought to be taking the temperature and seeking the input and information from as broad a set of experts as they believe they can trust. And by trust here, I mean experts who are using the information they have access to, not to advance their own personal or organization's interests or agendas, but rather to take the information and expertise that their position, their life experiences provide that could be beneficial to address the problem at hand. Now, this issue of trust and whose advice can a leader trust, I mean, this is something every individual in a leadership role, regardless of whether you're leading a Boy Scout troop or the United Nations or the President of the United States, figuring out whose advice and who you can trust to advance the organization or the broader community's interest is a staggering challenge. And it has brought leaders of all stripes to their knees.
I'm going to cluster a few questions together, pivoting off of that, Allan, and focus a little bit on President Trump. Chuck Bruce asked, with respect to the current crisis, what are the strengths and weaknesses of Trump's leadership style? How much of leadership is instinctual? When is this a strength or a weakness? Are there characteristics or traits that make for a better leader? And the way that I really want to frame it to you is, having run a leadership school, can leadership be taught, or do people just have it? And you can feel free to answer that part of it with President Trump or not, but I am curious to know how much gut instinct really is a part of making decisions.
Yeah, so there's sort of three things you've combined there. I'll take them in the order in which they return to my mind. So the one about leaders, are they made or formed? As the dean of a leadership school, I used to get that question literally all the time. And I think it's a completely appropriate question. There's been a lot of research into this, and there's a lot of anecdotal information as well. It appears that has so many things about human beings. It's a combination of the two. There are certain attributes, particularly for leadership during crises. People in leadership roles have to be willing to be decisive, and they have to be able and willing to weigh difficult choices in costs and benefits, and not everyone is either willing or able to do so, for example. And there's lots of attributes that we could talk about. Those attributes that all great leaders, good leaders possess can be trained and honed. And militaries, organizations, businesses invest huge amounts of resources and time into this. Regarding instinct, so this harks back to an earlier set of questions and sort of things we talked about a few minutes ago when you were talking about Secretary Rumsfeld. One of the things that characterizes decision-making under conditions of uncertainty versus risk. When we talk about risk, we mean that we can calculate the odds or the probabilities or the proportions across different outcomes and the relative costs and benefits. When we talk about decisions under uncertainty, we mean we really don't know. We can't say when a vaccine, for example, for the coronavirus will be produced. We can come up with a guess, but there are a lot of different coronaviruses out there that firms have tried to create vaccines for previously with modest at best success. So in fact, we don't know. Someone in a leadership role facing true uncertainty has to rely on their proverbially or colloquially referred to as their gut, their instinct. Their brain will take into account all of the informal information that they have, weigh the probabilities in ways we, as social psychologists, economists, and political scientists, we don't really understand well, and they need to make decisions. And this is where instinct comes in. This is where lifetimes of experience dealing with difficult, high-stakes decisions provide a capacity for people that, if those decisions, often by chance, turn out to be the right decision, the decisive, good outcome decision, those people end up receiving the label of great leader. There will be many instinctive decisions that were made in conditions of uncertainty that turned out badly through no fault of the decision maker or organization's own. And unfortunately, those leaders frequently are labeled as bad leaders just because they caught a bad break. Now, as for President Trump, again, if we look at the polling about President Trump, a majority of Americans find his press conferences and find his leadership acceptable, supportive. They find comfort in his press conferences. There are obviously many Americans also that feel quite exercised by some of the ways that he presents information. I think the people that enjoy, find useful, find comfort in President Trump's communication style and manner, which is distinctive. I think we can say that and all agree about that. He has a certain folksy manner that many people, and this is how he got elected president, that many people can identify with. And that is an extraordinary, extraordinary advantage that a leader has. The folkiness or willing to conjecture exacerbates or undermines how his critics look at him, and that that's unfortunate, particularly in the polarized environment that we have today. As a leader, President Trump is reflective of the society that he is leading, and he was elected by a group of people who are quite devoted to him, and in many cases with very good reason. The president has signaled concerns, for instance, about global supply chains and people's jobs being displaced by other countries' more affordable labor than American labor. Those types of early signals developed a degree of credibility that the president has been able to take advantage of with a group of supporters that he communicates with quite effectively. those supporters, the president's political critics, have not been as charitable with those in those groups as they might have been. I think the critics and supporters of the president is reflective of the challenges we face in the country. All in all, the president, as many leaders in Western Europe have done, have struggled with the decisions they've had to make. I think that all in all, the decisions where we are, if we look at the data, the United States is doing as well or marginally better than most of our Western European allies and confreres.
Let me take that in a couple different directions. I am struck, Allan, in watching a number of governors, Democrats and Republicans, Mike DeWine and Andrew Cuomo, Gavin Newsom in California, who acted early on doing things like shutting down their states, having people remain in place and the like. There have been a series of other governors who have been a little bit slower to make those calls. And only recently, when the president finally leaned into some of those, both decisions and decision makers, did they start to do that. I think one thing that we saw in South Korea was that they did act early. And I think if you look at their curves, they're doing a better job containing the crisis than a lot of Western European leaders. And my understanding, though, without exact knowledge, is that some of those that acted earlier seem to be doing better in the polls than President Trump. I haven't seen what some of the later actors have done, what the opinion polling reflects there. One could take the conclusion from that though they were making painful decisions, voters or public opinion has responded to early decision makers better than to later decision makers. And I'm wondering, is that something that we tend to see in crises? Does decisive, early, clear, and consistent action tend to get rewarded by publics, or does one run the risk of being wrong and then having to switch back and having to defend actions that weren't right in the moment?
So political leaders that are decisive, quick, and make the right decision that people end up being comfortable with typically are rewarded for it. Whether those decisions were right, if we look back retrospectively, whether those decisions were right because they were clairvoyant or had access to better information, or they simply got lucky, we won't know for a long time. I think you're absolutely right that what we know today, many people in leadership roles, many of us as concerned, engaged citizens, we would have liked to have known what we know today 8 weeks ago. I don't think there's any question about that. We can point to political leaders on both sides of the aisle. The mayor of New York, Mayor de Blasio, before he's asked to lock down the city, urged New Yorkers to go out and behave like New Yorkers. Right. And I think that was an unfortunate piece of advice.
Yeah.
The governor of New York admonished the mayor for asking for the city to be shut down. And
we have Democratic governors now fighting over whether residents from one state can travel to another, as well as Republican governors only accepting people back into I think the governor of Florida is only accepting people off a cruise ship who are Floridians and not accepting non-Floridians.
I think that, there's a broader point here, though, that I personally anyways find both interesting and important, and it's the role of ideology. I think that if we look across both the states and countries that closed their borders and urged or required their citizens to restrain their movements later, these tended to be conservative governments, conservative politicians. And I think that reflects their underlying ideological priors. And this is a huge challenge, so if we think about the Great Depression in the United States, both politicians and economists all had an ideological belief that budget deficits were a terrible, terrible thing. We now know that belief and understanding probably caused the Great Depression to persist several years longer than it might have needed to. What brought the end of the Great Depression was the beginning of World War II for the United States. The security threat in World War II became so great that it forced leaders, advisors, experts of all stripes to abandon their ideological backgrounds and to recognize, hey, the United States has to rearm. We have to build a military capable of responding to the threats coming out of both Europe and Asia. That development of our military capacity dragged the United States out of the Depression in relatively short order. In that instance that spread over several years, political leaders' ideological, essentially, backgrounds blinkered them. It blinded them to what they needed to look at to be able to make the right decisions. Now today, again, sort of the information environment has, and a variety, a whole host of things from technology to social media have accelerated the pace of decision making. That's a good thing. Again, if we think about the pace of decision making in the United States and elsewhere, with regard to the pandemic, with regard to the economy, if we think about how much has been done and how quickly in the past 6 to 7 weeks, it's actually quite extraordinary. And again, the conservative governors, leaders, perhaps were slower out of the blocks than their more progressive counterparts, perhaps due to ideological reasons. But at this point, either on their own or through the urging of the central government, the presidency, almost all states and communities within the United States have come within line within a period that's extraordinary. If we think about the
probably with greater public consensus, because the leaders in the states where they were elected now understand and embrace what they're doing.
I think that's a great point. And again, in crises where acting quickly is at the very essence of it, sometimes this is a weakness of democracies in certain circumstances. The need to generate public consent for action can delay action. Again, we saw this in World War II. The Roosevelt administration in 1939, 1940 would have been preferred to be able to act more quickly, but the American public simply wasn't ready to support that. And if we think back about the passage of the military draft and the US entry into the war, the draft legislation, the conscription, passed with one vote. It could have just as easily failed. So again, it's easy to, hindsight is 2020. It's easy to Monday morning quarterback, to mix my metaphors here, the decisions that our leaders have made over the past 2 months. But all in all, there seems to be extraordinary consensus that has emerged quite quickly relative to similar or different types of problems we're facing.
I want to come back to hindsight, including looking back on the crisis and both what and when is appropriate to do an evaluation. But I do want to go to, you're talking about war, and particularly given your own personal background, having served and then also studied military leaders of one kind or another. We've heard the president talk about this as a war. I've heard the Secretary of Defense talk about it as a war where the enemy is this invisible one that's out there. But when you hear those analogies, what works and what doesn't work? I mean, one thing that goes through my mind is Dwight Eisenhower reflecting back on the D-Day invasion, where he says plans are worthless, but planning is everything. There's the phrase that no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. But I am curious to hear you reflect on military leaders who do an enormous amount of planning. That's what most of the time, I think of the military as similar to airplane flight, right? Which is hours of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. But it's those moments of boredom and in planning that make for successful leaders. Do those analogies fit, or is this entirely different because it's a different enemy?
It's again another great question. The president has invoked the war analogy, and I think there are several advantages for doing so. One, it tends to get people's attention, although I think too many presidents and leaders in other countries have gone to that well perhaps too many times over the past 10 to 20 years. But in this case, it seems to be resonating with many members of the general public. Labeling this as a war conveys that this is a true threat, that the risk of this pandemic is something that is a national burden. It's a concern that uh, there are communities in the country where, for instance, the virus has not surfaced to the same intensity or extent that it has in others. New York today is living in very different circumstances. My home is in the Shenandoah Valley, where there are relatively very few cases, and the feel of things is different. When political leaders invoke the use of a war analogy, it signals to all of us, hey, pay attention. This is a serious thing. I think that it also, doing so, as you pointed out, it puts on the table within the president's advisory group both the degree of seriousness, but it also empowers individuals within those advisory groups to speak up. During periods of less salient, or not so much less intensity, but situations or decision-making environments that are not true crises, we often see problems of groupthink. And groupthink can be driven by everyone in the group simply agreeing, or it can be a group where people say, look, this isn't that big a deal. I'm going to keep my mouth shut because I don't want to have to deal with the consequences of it. When people in leadership roles signal both to the people in their advisory group, but also members of the general public, that the problem being dealt with is of grave and great concern, that empowers critics. And that can be inconvenient, it can be unpleasant. But I think that as Abraham Lincoln showed by pulling together teams of rivals, that hearing from lots of dissenting views can be very beneficial.
I want to go to the after action report. I know that that's a big part of the military. We've all adopted that phrase in many ways outside of the military to assess one thing or another that we've done. And in the United States, we have enormous examples of those kinds of after action reports, everything from the Warren Commission that looked into the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which completely changed the way presidents are protected, and to the 9/11 Commission, which was directed, as many people know, by my predecessor, Philip Zellico, who's a faculty member in the history department and one of our colleagues at the Miller Center still. I'm curious to get your take on those. Are they valuable? And if so, in this case, how and when do we put something like that together? When is it appropriate to look back on a crisis? When do you know you're out of a crisis? Or should you start doing that kind of assessment even once we've exited a first phase, but while other phases are still going on?
You know, it's interesting. Dr. Fauci in his briefing, it was either yesterday or the day before, talked a little bit about that. And he was responding to a question about vaccines versus serum antibody tests versus testing of people actually having the disease. And he said, look, we have to be able to deal with things in order of precedence and prior. And he said, look, the vaccine is 12 to 18 months down the road. We're working, there are firms, businesses, the task force is attuned to that. There are lots of people working on that right now, but we have immediate concerns that have to be dealt with right now. I think that we now know, we know from both private industry, manufacturing, policy making, but manufacturing, that keeping an eye on continuous improvement, and business people will say, duh. In government, it's not always quite so clear. But Fauci was quite clear about that we have different streams of information that we need to be attending to continuously, but in their proper order. So I think on the one hand, yes, we have to pay attention to the incoming information. We have to evaluate. We have to be willing to change course as the information dictates. At the same time, the Warren Commission, the 9/11 Commission, I think that's an evaluation of sort of a different sort that certainly will occur, I don't know, a year, 2 or 3 years from now. Those evaluations are the ones that hopefully we will be able to have full information when those types of after action reviews are done, so that there will be lessons learned about the mistakes that were made by design, the mistakes that were made inadvertently, the things that we got right inadvertently, the things that we got right deliberately. But those broad scaled stop, hold the presses type action reviews, I think prudentially need to wait until we actually have full information and everything that we would need to know.
And in the current moment, I've already seen that members of Congress are moving forward with trying to establish congressional oversight. Is that valuable in a crisis? I mean, it's in some ways it's a different version of the question before about the press asking questions, but for instance, in the distribution of emergency economic aid and assistance, there was a holdup and finally a solution of an oversight panel. Although the president in his signing statement evidently said that he would not be paying as much attention to that. What is the value of oversight of leaders while the crisis is actually happening?
So from the outset of this conversation, one of the themes about crises is the time constraint. In a true national crisis, such as the one the United States, the Western Europeans, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Taiwanese, the world is in, there's not a lot of oversight of executive leadership. And that is due both a result of the time constraint and also as a result of emergency power declarations made at both the national, state, and local level. And that's by design. There's some oversight. There was Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin in his negotiations with the House and Senate members and leadership. There was give and take, and there will be some oversight about how the money is spent. But frankly, you can't spend several $1 trillion with the degree of oversight that we would both expect, plan for, and hope for during more normal times.
Let me go to a question from Chudi Obi, which goes to the consequences of this particular crisis. You talked at the beginning, Allan, about how we live in a globally integrated society, but one with big power shifts going on between the United States and China, among others. And Mr. Obi asks, we've seen a bit of weakness of each nation's domestic supply line as the global supply chain was hit hard. After the crisis, we see an even stronger adherence and movement to domestic production. Do you think the COVID-19 pandemic has shown some cracks in globalism?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the globalization, the internationalization, not so much internationalism, the internationalization of supply chains, the globalization of supply chains, the globalization of political leadership, that was under attack, and there were cracks in that facade that led to the election of populist leaders in Western Europe and the United States. President Trump is a product of growing skepticism amongst working class, blue collar people in the United States, and similarly in a number of Western European countries. It is a great danger to make forecasts or predictions about the future in the midst of a crisis. These turn out to be wrong an extraordinary number of times. That said, here I go. I think that because the globalization, as we've come to understand it, was under great pressure, assault, attack, cracks, however you want to phrase it, leading up to this crisis, I think what the coronavirus pandemic will do is provide support for and strength to the arguments of the critics of globalization who existed already. I think that people within administrations, both in the United States and elsewhere, for example, that had argued that stockpiling items of critical need, whether they're medical supplies, whether they're other types of foodstuffs, for instance, just-in-time delivery systems for manufacturing food supplies. There have been people that have been critical of this, but those voices have been largely tamped down by the demand for greater efficiency in stock returns. I think those voices are going to come to the fore again. I think there will be a recognition amongst the supporters of globalization that even their greatest supporters need to revisit some of their assumptions about the gains from it, or certainly revisit assumptions about the risks associated with what political scientists have referred to for 30 years as complex interdependence.
Mm-hmm. Let me come from that and then back to leaders and leadership. Larry Bleiberg asks, what risks do you see arising from leaders themselves coming down with the virus? We know that Boris Johnson has it. We've seen leaders outside of politics, from Tom Hanks to Chris Cuomo coming down with the crisis. People who lead in different industries. What about it ravaging the federal government workforce? And I'm curious, Allan, in this sense about, again, whether there are analogies from the military. We've seen military leaders taken out, in particular military engagements of one kind or another, and or the effect that the loss of key lieutenants has on leaders as they see others taken down in a war and a conflict. Abraham Lincoln famously during the war lost one son to illness and was there very protective about one of his own sons joining the army. I'm just curious about the personal dimensions of this for leaders and your thoughts about that.
So I think there's sort of two themes to your question. One is the role, what is the impact of turnover, whether it's through illness, casualty, age, or otherwise. So large organizations work through, plan for extraordinary turnover, even in the best of times. Most leaders tend to overstate their individual importance. And again, I don't want to belittle or minimize the notion that leadership change and turnover, whether it's the leader themselves or within their organizations, is something we shouldn't be concerned about. But, for example, in World War II, the United States Army, either through casualty, illness, or by being relieved, there was turnover of literally hundreds of general officers. And in a majority of those cases, the units that had to work through leadership turnover, the performance of those units actually improved when new leadership came in. Now, I'm not advocating leadership change or turnover in the midst of a crisis. Proverbs such as "don't change horses in midstream" come from somewhere. Leaders' personal views and challenges, there's an enormous biographical store of information about how political leaders' personal views have shaped their own decision-making. And this is something that we understand about both presidents and, people at every level. Because people in the executive roles, they're people. And they're subject to the same types of emotional concerns, family concerns that all of us are. They're many times in the difficult situation of not being able to personally act on those concerns. We hope that people in leadership roles will make their decisions as rationally as possible based on as much and as best information as possible. But they're people, and we should recognize that as such when we bear our knives in critiques of all of them.
Yeah, particularly if you're doing cold and hard cost benefit analysis, which appear to be rational, there's a compassionate dimension, and every different leader manages that differently. Allan, I just as we're coming up on an hour here, just to close, is there something now that we've gone through this conversation that sticks out, either that you want to reinforce or that you left unanswered in your own mind about this? What do you have a takeaway for us that you'd like us to think about as we leave this session and as we watch the events continue to unfold?
Yeah, I think that, what's become clear in the conversation to me and reading through the questions as they've appeared online is I think that while we can look, this is a tremendously challenging and difficult period in time for everyone in this country and countries around the world. I think that we need to recognize that while there will certainly be exceptions, the vast majority of leaders, whether they are leaders within the health professions, whether they are leaders within our political communities, they're doing the best they can under extraordinary uncertainty. In my opening observations, I think I would really like to sort of repeat a little bit about how unusual and unique this crisis and set of circumstances we find ourselves as a society are in. This has never happened before. And our political leaders and medical community are doing the very best that they can under the most extraordinary of circumstances. And that, as you pointed out, Bill, criticism can play a very valuable role. It can bring otherwise sort of ignored concerns to the fore that we've ignored in the past at our now current peril. At the same time, I think that there's, over the past few years on both sides of the aisle, a mean-spiritedness in our political conversations and policy conversations that we would do well to set aside.
Well, Allan, in the spirit of positive spiritedness, we're really appreciative of your time with us and the positive, optimistic tone that you bring to these issues, not to mention your own experience and leadership at the university and beyond. Thanks to you all for joining. We really appreciate your engagement. We have 2 more of these we're lining up for next week, one on Tuesday and one on Thursday, I believe. Pay attention to your Miller Center email events, webinar announcements, which will be forthcoming. And thanks you all for joining.